to this program of Walter Rodney Groundings. I'm your host, Deon Abrams, and this evening's program we have guests in Mr. Aubrey Retmyer, and today the focus will be the State Assets Recovery Agency, SARA, and so we'll talk about that. I want to welcome Mr. Retmyer to today's Walter Rodney Groundings.
Thank you, Deon.
And to the viewers out there, I want to welcome you again for being with us this evening to discuss matters of importance to all of us here in this beautiful land of ours. I noticed that the WPA put out a statement recently in relation to the dismissals that are taking place as it is said left, right, and center across the country. And SARA, as you know, would have been one of those agencies that was targeted in this way. So, Mr. Retmyer, SARA, or the background to the agency, what would you want to give us first?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Deon, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the program to say something about SARA. As you know, I was the Deputy Director of SARA, and Professor Thomas was the Director. Neither he nor I are here to beg for jobs or to complain. I'm here simply to defend our record, as is publicized by some of the newspapers that SARA did nothing. Is absolutely nonsense and poor journal. Poor investigative work on their part. Let me just say, by way of history, that before the 2015 elections, Professor Thomas had been writing a series of articles about the levels of corruption in this country, and that Guyana was classified in some quarters as a narco state. As a result of that, when the Granger administration came to office, he was asked to head this unit, and I was asked to be his deputy. Of course, the government at that time, I do not believe that they fully understood all the challenges that would be involved in recovering state assets. So we formed this unit, which was directly under the Ministry of the Presidency, and they sent us some individuals. And before we could really get after anything, we realized that this matter of recovery could not simply take place in a vacuum. So we sought at a very early stage to have a bill and later an act. I could recall approaching a certain lawyer because of the television station and question of suing and that sort of thing. I would avoid calling names. One of the same lawyers who screams the loudest, I approached his office and we asked him if he would assist with the bill. Granted, I did not know all that was involved, and certainly that was a lot of work. So if he had said to me that it was too much work to be done pro bono, I would understand. But instead, he said he could not do it, and I moved on. At the same time, I recall Mr. Rambo Gaskin making a statement in the newspaper that the government had been pussyfooting, and I quote, pussyfooting about recovering assets, and nothing was done. I met with Mr. Gaskin in Main Street, at Demico in Main Street. I explained to him personally that we were anxious to get on with this matter, but that we needed a bill. Because that particular meeting was cut short, I invited him again to the Ministry of the Presidency, where we had a little office there, and we spoke at length, and he was made to understand we are trying to get a bill, and once that bill was passed and made an act, he would be invited to participate. Yet one night, right at this this television station, at this very counter, Mr. Gaskin reported a different story. I wanted to say that while we understood very early that our role was to recover state assets, I understood also that it was important to close the doors, in other words, improve the systems, because it was no point going after things which were lost and not preventing things which are there from going. So we decided that what we will try to do is to ensure at least you close the loopholes that were still in existence. You can stop me at any time you want some clarifications. We also understood that while we wanted to go about asset recovering, it was important to decide on what would constitute the assets we were looking after. And in this case, we had to know what we had to determine what we would lose or what we would have lost. So we broke up asset recovery and national patrimony into 5 areas. We said vehicles and movable equipment would be one category, buildings would be another category, land another category, money, and then gold. And it was on the basis of these categories that we sought to work. Now, between 2015, around September, when we started doing some things, up to 2017, there was SARA, which was a unit. And anybody who knows anything about recovery will realize that without a lawyer, you can't recover anything through the law. So we had things which we could do without going to court, and we tried to do a lot of that. And then when we became an agency from May 2017 to recent, then we were operating because at that time we had lawyers. So we could take no case to court before 2017 because we didn't have lawyers. Now, for the benefit of the public, while people are shouting and screaming at the top of their voices and confusing people, there's a difference between SOCU and SARA, or SOCU and SARA. And for the benefit of the folks who may not be conversant with the acronyms, now SOCU is the criminal investigate. They deal with criminal issues. SARA would deal with the civil aspect of it. Making a simple example, if a person should steal something, let's say a person steals $20 million and he is taken before the courts, it will be SOCU to prosecute for the criminal offense and SARA to attempt to retrieve or recover the 20 million. So people would walk up to officers and staff of SARA or SARA and say to us, when you all gonna lock up this body? When you all gonna lock up the body? The first thing they need to understand, our act does not give us the power to lock up anybody. What we attempt to do is to recover whatever was stolen, and you have to prove the case. And if needs be, add a penalty to that. So we try to live within the bounds of the law and what we could and should do. Also, I like to, for the benefit of the public, first of all, as a Christian believer, I owe it to Christ. As a citizen, I owe it to my fellow citizens of this country. And as a person, my conscience tells me that once I'm given a job, I must work as diligently as possible at that task. So to say that SARA did nothing is nonsense, and I'll go on to advance actual facts.
But the question before we go into the details of the work of SARA, you did distinguish among the 3 agencies, SARA, and SOCU, SARA, and
SOCU, SARA, and SARA. SARA became SARA. Okay. After the act, SARA, we dropped the unit and it became an agency because we wanted a certain amount of autonomy.
Mm-hmm. But to some extent, in the PPP's release upon the disbanding of the agency, they're claiming that the agency was kind of illegal, that the establishment was somehow contrary to provisions that should have been in the law?
Well, I don't know how illegal we could be if there was an act. It is true that neither Professor Thomas nor myself, we were the committee that should have been constituted to appoint us. At least we were never invited, even though we did mention on several occasions that we would prefer to have this thing out of the way. It was a judgment of the then Attorney General and his staff that they were concerned because 3 months after the act was passed, Mr. Gaskin took the agency to court, and that case is still to be heard. It has been 3 years resting on somebody's desk, and it has never been called. So the concern was that even if we go after cases and we won them, if some aspect of the act was overturned or the entire act was overturned, then there would be a question of restitution. And this might have been some of the things that were under consideration by the Attorney General's office. He is an individual. He can be asked why Professor Thomas cannot appoint himself, neither could I. So as far as we were concerned, we were ready, we were prepared, but we were not invited. Now, coming back to what the point I was making, is that, again, while the public is made to believe that acts of recovery is a matter of today you submit the case or you hear of something, by tomorrow you get an answer, that is not so, my brothers and sisters. That is not so. The average global case in dealing with asset recovery takes 6 years. That's the global average. We were sort of properly appointed or properly constituted less than 3 years. We were constituted, well, we were constituted in May, right enough, but by the time August, the case was in court, so the act was challenged. Even so, with all things being equal, we are still less than 4 years since we were constituted as an agency. So that if you look at us or compare us with the world at large, we have cases prepared. We haven't advanced them because of the situation, but we have performed better than most other countries in the world in terms of preparing cases and getting them ready for court. Also, we realize that globally, it is said about $1 trillion, the global loss is about $1 trillion due to corruption. The recovery rate is less than 10% globally. So SARA acted with considerable flexibility and initiative in trying to close the gap rather than having things go in the first place, to ensure that we work with agencies to slow down or close the gap. As an individual, I took corruption very seriously.
Explain a bit more about this closing the gap.
Well, when you look at a number of government agencies and ministries, the way they function, there was room for corruption.
Okay.
And people would call us, they would write us, they would visit us, and they would tell us what they saw within these agencies, ministries, or regions. And then we would decide what action we would best take to address the situation. And it was not in all cases that you could go to court. It was better to do some things outside of the court because it would make more sense in going to court. First of all, you have to build a whole case. And while it was good to go after things and make cases, it was glaring to us that a number of areas in the administration, there were still things to be done to close those gaps.
And those gaps were...
I'll give you some ideas.
Okay, they came from the previous...
Yes, they came from the previous administration. As I go along, I'm prepared to provide some greater clarity. When we take into consideration, let's say, vehicles, when the Granger administration came to office, there was sheer chaos and confusion amongst several ministries regarding vehicles. There was no current workable inventory. You had vehicles that were supposed to be assigned to one ministry with another ministry, and vice versa. If you were to take a look in the back of the yard between Colburn House and what we call the villa on Homestretch Avenue, there was a pool of mud. I'm not exaggerating by saying this. A pool of mud, and about 15 to 20 vehicles were stuck in that mud and left there. Now, these were the kinds of things that we found not only there but other places. Hence, we were able to talk to the city council, and the city council spoke with a particular citizen, and we were able to use that yard on the Mandela Avenue, which is the extension of Mandela Avenue going toward the ramp. And we were able to put vehicles there because from time to time as we collected vehicles and we could not easily identify them, we then held them there until they were properly identified. In some cases, we were able to work with the GRA and other agencies to get data that would allow us to identify who purchased the vehicle and therefore to whom it belonged. So we spent several months moving among agencies on the coast here and ministries and in the regions dealing with this matter. We physically visited 9 out of 10 regions to deal with this vehicle and plant issues so that we can ensure that these things were not stolen, misplaced, or unaccounted for. So after going through the regions, we visited region 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The only region we didn't physically visit within the first 6 months to a year was region 1.
Okay.
Now, I'll come back to the indigenous villages later on because of the problems we found there. Now, as we went to these villages and these regions, we did the same thing like we did out here, making sure that the regions could account by way of inventory for whatever plants or vehicle they had. We sent some men to Leg 1, to Wakenham, to the Essequibo coast. And there was the hospital at Sodi, for example, without an operational lighting plant because it could not have been accounted for. We traced that plant, and later on, if the records are checked, the Ministry of Health was able to identify where the plant was, have it fixed, and then took it to the hospital so it could be engaged in the use for which it was really intended. That's a clear case in which SARA was involved, found something, and helped the system. Now, our role is to deal with matters over $10 million. So the things which were below 10 million, not that they weren't important, but we will either report this to Suku or we will report to the police, and they would then deal with it. But if the value exceeded 10 million, and it had to be very clear to us, it was taken from government's possession to private use. And once that transfer was made illegally, then that was our reason for acting. If we could not prove that, you couldn't take the case to court. But at least common sense did help us. So we understood that people were stealing things, and therefore it was necessary as patriots of this country to save the country when you can. It wasn't a matter of pure raw politics and calling names and jumping from one side to the next. We were consistent in what we did, and we made sure that no government minister or anybody called to give Professor Thomas or myself any directives. We worked purely on the forensic audits and the other reports which came to us, as I said, by people coming in to visit, by writing or by telephone calls. Let me, John, move on to...
Okay, go ahead. All right.
Let's take buildings. The same problems we found with buildings, with vehicles, the same problems we had with buildings. We worked on the coast, we worked in the regions, identifying buildings that were supposed to be government's property, but were now in the hands of people. We found all kinds of scenarios. You had people who were in government buildings because, in the first instance, a relative who was entitled to living quarters by virtue of his or her occupation. You were sent to a region, or even on the coast here. They were sent to this, they were given the keys to this building or part of the building. And after their tenure had been finished, instead of the keys being returned to the source, they simply handed over those keys to a relative. And then sometimes that relative moved out and left it to another relative. I'm not exaggerating, these are facts. So some people did minor repairs to the building. Others did substantial repairs to the building. Others did, because the building deteriorated at such a rate, they broke it down and built over it. So we brought all of this to some regions, or to the regional authorities, and tried to work with them to get some order. Because this was not good enough. You couldn't continue to not know what you have or treat it as if it wasn't there and then complain when it was lost or stolen. So we worked with them to say, look, you have to address these problems. I know that in some cases the regions were successful, in other cases they were not. But at least we went through the details of having this. We found some cases, at least one case, in which people even did put in their will government building. And so it is a question where that region had to work, I think, with the authorities to ensure that they dealt with it as best they could at that point. While still on buildings, I could tell you that there are buildings that the government has and should have been under the control of the Ministry of Infrastructure, now the Ministry of Works. And they have a ledger, and people could visit that ledger, and that's an inventory that has been worked on, and I think we should continue to work on it to make sure that we can account for the buildings we have, at least in Region 4. And there are several other regions that have buildings that people need, the government needs to decide what they will do with it. And you have to work through the REOs and the other regional authorities to make sure that those assets are recovered. As far as land is concerned, when we were assigned our tasks, we realized, okay, Guyana has 83,000 square miles. If you have 83,000 square miles, then somebody must be able to answer sensibly for the geographic landmass. There's no one agency up to now that's responsible for land in this country. And so even though we wanted to go to one source and get information, we found that we had to invite and work with 6 different stakeholders. You have to deal with Lands and Surveys Department. You have to deal with CHNPA, Gaisuku, GGMC, GFC, and MMA. All those stakeholders control various parcels of land in this country. GGMC would control the subsurface, while GFC, Guyana Forestry Commission, would control the surface. So you can have somebody having a lease for a piece of land to clear the trees for timber, and you have somebody laying claim to the below the soil for mining. All those things. So we had regular monthly meeting with these agencies so we can all put our heads together and work to come up with what we think would eventually be a national land use, a national land policy.
Okay.
So that Guyanese should be able to know what we own and what we do not own. We found that in some cases the rate at which lands were given away. You will not have land, even though we are less than 1 million, we should have lands stretching way into the next century. Instead of that, the people were able to get lands from the various categories without any single person keeping a total record of what you have. In other words, you could have gone to MMA, get 1,000 acres. Then you go to GGMC and you get another 1,000. Then you go to forestry, you get another 1,000. We need to be able, as a responsible set of people, say this is what Mr. Abrams has, this is what Retmyer has. So without being sensational, we were able to work with these 6 agencies and try to move toward a land policy. We are not yet there, and of course, whatever happens now happens, but at least we were working toward that. It was because we were successful to a certain degree in dealing with this kind of thing that we were able to use some of these agencies that they call to retrieve lands from two large land holders. And we were able in that process to retrieve over 1 million acres of land.
From
Yes,
two people?
from two individuals. Because you don't want to put Channel 9 in trouble, I won't call names. But I'm saying, check the records. Let people go and check between GGMC and GFC. You will find that there were two agencies there that were leasing lands in this country, 99-year lease at 25 cents US per acre per year. They paid 25 US cents per acre per year, and the lease was for 99 years. We were able to withdraw that. Now, there were people, there was a certain individual renting a piece of land on the West Demerara. The individual was renting that land. It was said to be, we didn't send in a surveyor to measure it, but it was supposed to be 100 acres of land with about 4 or 5 buildings on the land, and the lease per year was $100,000. Now, Deon, you can't get a small building to rent in this city properly for $100,000 per month. But that person was renting that at $100,000 per year. We successfully spoke to the agency and said, look, this thing makes no sense. We're wasting government assets in this manner, and we would like you to act. And fortunately, they acted and withdrew the lease again from that individual because this was misuse of government property.
And all these transactions that took place under the previous
Yes, of course. I mean, the lease were signed with the previous administration. So when the Granger administration came in, we simply tried to ensure that we would take back as much as possible. Because while, you know, there was a lot of noise made about Pradoville 2 and so on, there are other people with lands. And I felt that I had no bone to chew with anybody living in Pradoville 2. I felt as a Guyanese, I'm given a task, and I should work toward dealing with issues at hand. And so whenever we found people and in many cases these things were reported to us. So we investigated on the basis of reporting. When once we found it was true, we pursued until we got success. We also, let me just move on to money. We also were able to trace and find monies that people we believe had misappropriated. But the methods by which we used, we could not take those methods to court as evidence. And so we were in the bind where the government was not willing to give money for that purpose, so you could only see the information. You couldn't copy it, you couldn't record it. You could see it. And if you wanted it, then you had to pay for it. So since the government wasn't prepared to pay because in any case it can't be used as evidence, that was a situation that we just had to let go. But when people say we found nothing, and somebody mentioned that we didn't find a pencil, by the time I'm finished here, except that person can convince me that a pencil is worth several millions, then we'll have found far more than pencils. Now, let me just move on and make one other thing about money. As regards money, SARA received at least two checks. It can be checked out at the Ministry of Finance from two persons who bought lands in Pradoville 2 and came in to settle with us. Those checks were in the vicinity of $10.5 million each. So if you add that, you get at least $21 million. So whoever wrote about SARA didn't get even a pencil should check that out. Now, when we move on to gold in this country, there is a gap between your production and your reports, your declaration. So it is the conclusion of people from the gold board that there was a significant gap between gold that was produced and gold that was declared. And there was about 40% difference. So if a person was said to produce 100 ounces of gold, they'd only report about 60. And the international community that have to deal with terrorism were concerned. And so approaches were made, and we assisted the Gold Board working with the Gold Board at that time. And we were able to close the gaps in the methods in which they would use to ascertain what was mined or produced and what was declared. There are systems which we were introducing that would allow the average miner to record how much mercury you use, how much fuel you use, and a number of other pieces of data that would indicate after a while what his production should be like in a given area.
Okay.
So, working with the Gold Board, and I want to single out, there are two persons that need credit. Before we could even get off the ground, because none of us had any training with asset recovery. So we didn't have any idea in which direction we should really pursue this thing. Minister Sharma brought somebody to our office a Friday afternoon and said, look, I had invited these people to work with me on a matter. I believe they can be of great help to you. And that representative was from the Caribbean Institute of Forensic Accounting. That was a very, very, very valuable connection. And even when I see Minister Sharma, I always want to tell him thanks, because I think he was able to put us onto somebody who really understood what asset recovery was all about. And we worked with that agency. We were given money to train our staff, and that agency became the agency with which on which we relied for the majority of the training of the local staff here. Apart from the training that we had staff sent to El Salvador, we had staff sent to the United States, we had staff sent to Trinidad, and altogether, the training of the staff, I think, would have made them good, sound professionals in those fields.
But I was just going to make the point, because you were saying that these people were trained.
Yes.
And they were trained by professional
yes.
agencies and so
The records
so
are there.
They have now acquired a level
Yes.
of competence that really should be of help to this country.
Yes.
Where are those people now?
Well, everybody got letters last week, Tuesday afternoon. The point is, from the time the government changed and we saw the sacking of people left and right, it didn't mean whether you performed or not. I'm just making this as a reference. Every Guyanese in this country knows that the best time for Guyanese receiving water service is basic service. Van West Charles was able to move this today. This is the best time for us as a nation. The quality, the quantity, the reliability, and on are all of its best point for Vanna to go. So it wasn't a question whether you perform or not perform. If there's a political agenda to get you out of the way, then some foolish excuse will be made. I only say the wrong, and Professor Thomas, to his credit, only say the wrong also, because we felt it was a responsible thing to do. No leader, no person in authority should have a professional set of people working with them and then abandon them. So even though Professor Thomas, has 67 days leave, I have 76 days leave. We agreed, look, we will wait for somebody to come and visit. We will do the professional thing in handing over what we could to them. We will explain that our staff were not political hacks. At least the second half of the staff, about 22 or 23 of them, they responded to an advertisement in the newspaper in 2017. They were interviewed, selected and then interviewed. And the best of them were selected for this task. It wasn't a case where we simply picked up auditors, picked up case managers, picked up lawyers. We had them interviewed. And when they were successful, then is when they were recruited and assigned to us. So I make the point because some people felt that from the very next day we should have left. The only reason why we did not leave was because we felt we had an obligation to staff. I was trained in the GDF. When you, as an officer, when you are properly trained, you will never abandon your men. It's a commitment which you have to ensure that you look after them to your superiors as well as taking care of their needs. So we stayed there, and unfortunately or fortunately, Tuesday afternoon, we got 38 letters came because people had left on their own accord. So we were down to 38. Got 38 pieces of correspondence. The staff, every member was given a letter, and they were given 1 month notice, 13th of October to 13th of November. So their last working day should be the 13th of November. In the case of Professor Thomas and myself, it was immediate. So you get the letter at 10 to 4, and that was it.
No, all right, so this happened. What about, you said you wanted to remain so that you could do a proper handover, that you weren't expecting to,
Yeah.
be there in the new administration and all of that,
Yes.
but as a decent thing to do, you just wouldn't walk out on your staff.
Yes.
Was there any handing over? Were you visited? Is there these records that you were talking about?
We had no visits. We had no direct correspondence. So no letters came, no telephone calls, no visits. The only correspondence we received, we were told by the Ministry of Legal Affairs that we'll have a visit. In the very first week after the change of administrations, we were told within that very next week we'll have a visit. So we prepared a brief. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and we were all ready. That visit never took place. And as I said before, the only contact that we had with this administration was that Tuesday afternoon, we were sent these letters which says immediate termination. Okay? Well, let me go back to some other things which I want the public to check, because when people make these statements, we realize that there's a monopoly of media on the government side. Got several radio stations, at least one newspaper dedicated to them, and others may be sympathetic. They have several television stations. All we have is Channel 9. So I have to make the point on Channel 9. We didn't find a pencil. That's what they said. Let me tell them. If you go to Region 9, there's an excavator which is valued over between $15 and $20 million. By this current administration, that excavator was left there for years. The damage or the reason why it was not operational was minimal. When it was reported to us, I sent in a team there. We worked with them to have the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs fix the vehicle and move it. So we saved the government at least $15 million with one shot. A certain officer who was in the GDF, I won't call the person's name because if they don't want to admit, but that officer was always seated to me. He visited Region 1, and when he returned from Region 1, he called me, he said, Aubrey, I was in the Wauna area, and I've seen a piece of equipment parked in a yard. I think you should send some men to find out what's wrong with it and remove it from there. I responded, yes, sir. I then sent a team into Region 1. We found the piece of equipment. There was some sort of misunderstanding between the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs and the Ministry of Agriculture. My team and even I got involved and worked with them until that piece of equipment was properly repaired and removed from the location. That's another 15 or 20 million. So that is 30 million. I told you about the 2 tens, 21, 22 million dollars that we saved from Prattville. I could call this name, Randy Storm, when he was REO of Region 1. When going through the books, realized a piece of plant, a lighting plant, was sent to repair some 3 or 4 years before he took office. Randy Storm got some information and asked me to get involved. We found the piece of plant at the repair shop on the east bank here of Demerara. Randy was able to come down, pay off the repairs, and was able to remove the plant. I think the bill for the repair, he can more remember the numbers than I, but at least there was another $10 to $12 million in repair work. So you can, if you were paying that to repair it, you can understand the cost
Of the machine.
of the machine. That would have been left unattended. Those are specific things that SARA did. Now, an actuary would come in, assess what we've done, and determine whether or not we were able to earn or keep. I am positive that I can prove that SARA was worth far more than the $1 million that was spent on us. If you take, for example, the regions are given about 13% of the national budget, between 30 to 40 billion dollars annually to run their show. We were able to work with a number of REOs to cut down on what we found to be areas of corruption. For example, in the regions you have contractors. The regions have local engineers. It's not long before, excuse me, the engineers and the contractors are in cahoots to rob the government. If this government doesn't take action in it, well, it will continue. But I know that the REOs are not engineers. And whatever the engineers present to them, they'll sign. So the idea was to get some level of honesty. I recommended to the then Minister of Communities, hire an engineer, a competent man or woman, pay them well, and this is your person. So when they go into a region and they see something, you can ask them to go after the bigger projects. See if the person is working according to specifications. If there's a violation, then you deal with it early. You don't allow it to go on. If needs be, the engineer in the region must answer. If not, you'd have losses that would amount to billions in the end. Let me give you an idea. If you're building a road, the road is 2 miles long, and the subgrade is supposed to be laterite, and you use sand or some other subsurface material for 2 miles, you will save a hell of a lot of money there. If you put the asphalt instead of 3 inches thick, 2.5 inches thick, or 2 inches, you will save a hell of a lot of money.
No, you're robbing. The contractor is saving.
Yes, the contractor saves the money and robs the government.
All right.
That's why you had so many roads breaking up.
Okay.
Because the subsurface was not what it was supposed to be. The asphalt covering was not as thick as it was supposed to be. If you take the width of the road, let us say the width of the road is supposed to be 15 feet, and the man drops it at 14 feet, deliberately 14 feet, for 2 miles. You know how much money he saves? So all these areas, I spoke to several REOs. I said, I know you're not engineers, but press your engineers to look at these things carefully, and then go out from time to time and take a look. Randy Storm, for example, when he was REO, was able to go out and do that, and not sign off on several things. If you take wooden material, the estimate come in to do a bridge, and then you check, the man is buying dressed lumber. He put on an estimate for dressed lumber, and then he goes and collects rough lumber, because you don't need to build a bridge out of dressed lumber. But few REOs will take the time to understand the difference between these things. As a result, the contractor and the engineers were able to rip off several millions, and if you take 10 regions, you would lose billions of dollars a year. So I think that if you have 10 regions, and we aim at saving them at least $1 billion every year, then we will save 10 billion every year, and as the years multiply, so will our savings be. Another thing that we found would happen. One REO comes in and a man is selling, let's say, water or cell phone, any item, at a certain price. He is selling it for $1,000. Now, you come in and realize the man before you was paying $1,000. And you continue paying $1,000 without doing the checks to realize that this item really at source, even when it's supplied to you, should only be $700. The reason why the man was paying $1,000 was because 3 was for the man who was giving him the business. So you continue paying. He was making an additional $300.
Now that he ain't got to pay it.
Now he had to pay somebody else. Okay. So all those things, I spoke with several REOs, And I was able to convince them that, look, all of us are in this thing. A mosquito, when it's biting somebody, it's not biting APNU and PPP. It's biting anyway. Now, as I said before, I went about this thing with spirit and with conscience, because I am convinced that if we can solve the corruption problem in this country, we can solve the racial tensions we have. It's because, as I think Nigel Hughes said, we don't know how the corn is being shared. I knew that if we could solve the corruption or reduce that, because every country has corruption at different level. Once we could reduce the corruption problem, we can affect positively the racial integration in this country. If we can reduce the corruption in this country, we can reduce crime. If we can reduce the corruption in this country, we can improve our health index. All those things. So when I went after corruption, it wasn't because I was getting a salary.
No, but how does, I want to ask you a political question now. You mentioned at the beginning that Guyana was categorized at the international level as a narco state.
Yes.
And that narco also transcended to gold.
Yes.
And
so well, drugs mainly.
Drugs and gold. Yeah. Right? Because remember the various issues with gold.
Yes.
Now, was that all these things that you're talking about? Do you get a sense that it was part of officialdom?
Well, I would say that because the officials paid little or no interest rate, it was allowed to continue for much too long. The Granger administration asked us to do a job, and if you narrowly define the job, then you will do just what they say, go after stolen assets. But if you know, common sense and records tell you that your recovery rate at any way would be less than 10%, why on earth would you wait for things to be stolen or lost before closing the doors? So we spent an unusual amount of time and energy ensuring we reduce those possibilities for corrupt practices. Let me give you two more. Take gold. We work with the gold board, Mr. J.H.K. Lal, he is sacked also. G.H.K. Lal was sacked also. Lal made no small contribution to working toward the gold board being an improved body. We worked a number of systems, and we think that presently the systems that they have shows a significant improvement from what it was. It's not where we want it to be, but it's not where it was. Also, we are in the same category like several other South American countries, Colombia, Brazil, where the reporting is far less than the actual production. And of course, it is from various conferences that I attended, the concern is that people in the West, the Western countries, believe that when this goal is not properly accounted for, it ends up in the wrong hands of terrorist organizations, and as a result, their societies are imperiled. So they want to work with us to close those doors. A practical thing, that, and of course, this is something which can be checked. In 2012, a boat left Guyana without proper permission. Ended up in Curacao, and the gold that was transported on board that boat was alleged to have been stolen. But we understood that some of it was recovered. And we then decided to set out as best we could to investigate, see what records we had here. Of course, we had none. But we still went through and tried to send out an MLAT, a Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Send out this information to Curacao, saying, look, we are investigating after this matter, and Minister Ramjatan signed out the last piece of correspondence for it, and the idea was, look, if they have it, and we are prepared to cooperate with them at whatever level, then they should be able to keep 20 to 25% and return the rest to us. Some people say don't give them none. Well, they have all.
Okay.
So if you don't entice them or make the deal reasonable, they can afford to either not send any or send very little to you, because we don't know how much they recovered. We didn't get an official piece of correspondence saying they have recovered. The total amount was 12.5 million US.
Okay.
So we don't know how much they recovered, and we are hoping that when they do their investigations, these are governments and they have a certain level of honesty, we hope, and therefore they'd be able to say, communicate with the government and say, this is what we have. If they need more information, it's up to this administration to give it, and then to decide where do they go from there. All right. Let me just point out our relationships with some international agencies, not only about the goal. The MISISIC is a Spanish acronym. It's really a department. The OAS has a legal department. In that legal department, there are people there who are assigned as members of this MISISIC. It really means the Mechanism for the Implementation of the Inter-American Action Against Corruption. It's a Spanish acronym. I'm just translating for you in English.
Okay.
And Guyana has responsibilities. In order that we could maybe kill two birds with one stone, I was assigned or appointed what they call the lead expert. So you attend these conferences twice a year in Washington, and you come back here, and what they try to do is to, whatever treaties the country is signed to, there's no punitive action, but it's like peer pressure. So we visit countries, they account for, based on whatever round you are, they visit all the countries or get reports on all of them, and when everybody's satisfied a particular round, then they move to the next. There are times when people straddle rounds, but the idea is that Guyana should operate within the framework of this thing and be a responsible player. I won't tell you what I found about my predecessor, but I tried to do better, and I was prepared to brief whoever is coming to see me and will take over. I said, look, this is where we've gone. These are our shortcomings, and therefore, I would suggest you do it this way. We also, the last point I want to make is that the media, we're able to have a media department. And that media department trained over 2,000 persons on the issue of corruption, because part of the role of the SARA was to ensure that not only the staff but the population was better informed on how to deal with corruption. We trained people working at GRA, the GDF, Guyana Police Force, and several other government ministries and agencies. Mm-hmm. And I know the number was over 2,000. And we even did some training in Berbice the last few weeks ago with civil society. So I can go on, but I think it's prudent that I stop. And if you want to ask me any questions.
Yeah, but I mean, so one of the big things that people would have been talking about is the fact that several cases were taken to the courts, and in many instances, judgment was not in favor of SARA.
Well, we have completed several cases. Uh-huh. But the lawyers suggest, look, you don't set all of them in at the same time. In that way, you don't learn. So if you put in one and you hear the arguments, you can fine tune and deal with the next. We had two cases, not two, we had a number of cases with the Pradoville. People were invited to discuss, and let me digress here to say, look, 2 persons came in and settled with money. 3 others were lined up. Some came in physically, and so I'm saying some because I don't want to release numbers. Some came in physically, and some were on the phone to us. Some were emailing me. We believe that we should deal with these things with a certain level of confidentiality. And so even though I'm out of the job, I'm not careful to blab about who did what. That's for children. My point is that these people came in, they wanted to settle, but when the no confidence vote was passed, that was the end of their contact with us. They were engaged with myself and Professor for the longest while, but when the no confidence vote was passed, they broke off communication. That's a fact. Now, we sent cases to court, we sent against a particular agency where we felt that the land acquired was valued far below market value. The case didn't advance to the left to the point where a decision was made on whether this was so or not. There's some things we call technicality. So the lawyers argued. No, we sent up one lawyer. That the defenders put up 5 senior counsels against that one lawyer. If this was a flim-flam case, that wouldn't happen. So they put up 5 senior counsels against one lawyer. The lawyers, they argued, and the judge agreed that SARA should not take somebody to court. I think it was premised on the same situation, the case, how this case was in court and wasn't yet settled. So it had to be the director. But because Professor Thomas was not properly appointed, his name could not be used also. So in other words, you between the devil and the deep blue sea. We couldn't advance because SARA can't take it. Thomas can't take it because Thomas is not properly appointed. So on the basis of that, they knocked it out because of this technicality. It's like if we see a man commit a crime here. And this happens all the time. A man commits a crime. If he goes for a weak lawyer, a lawyer who has no recognition, more than likely the courts will deal with him accordingly. But no matter what the crime is, as long as you have the money to pay, you'll get off. That's a fact. People have killed not only in this country but around the world. And once you hire the highest gun. And they told us when we were doing some of these overseas conferences that corruption can be so endemic in some countries that it takes decades to fight it. Because once this thing is allowed to go several terms, judges, legal personnel, the entire state becomes more and more corrupted by the practices. And so when you're going up against that, you're the lone voice, you have a difficulty. I criticized the legal profession here. They said that I should have apologized. I didn't see the need for apologizing. Because when I attended this same Mississippi conference, there's a U-shaped table starting with Argentina, going right around to Uruguay. Guyana is somewhere in the middle there. But when you see these young Hispanic lawyers going after corruption with confidence and with energy, and you come back here and you see our folks, you hold your head because you want to know if we're in the same world.
Now tell me, we only have a few minutes more.
Sorry.
Now that we have the administration that was responsible for the degradation, of in all these areas that you were trying to fix,
Yeah.
how do you see the future for corruption in Guyana?
Well,
We already have Pyara.
yes. Well, look, I believe that at first there'll be considerable vigilance. And afterward, except there is some determination, they'll go right back to what it was. SARA played a role. It was always there. And if you notice, nobody can come and say SARA people ever take bribe. None of us took any bribe from anybody. We were content with what we earned. They could say whatever they paid us. And in fact, because of one man's salary and scream about SARA people's salary, some of my staff, at least 2 of them, one house was broken into, and for several nights another staff member had to be up very late because thieves were prowling around the area and the individual was concerned for the safety. But nobody could say, my staff took bribes. Professor Thomas, you can't fault the man in terms of integrity. And I follow suit. He from whatever angle, and me from the standpoint of a Christian believer. I will not take corrupt money because I don't need it. I believe in a heaven and a hell. And I believe that one day, even though you get off here, there's going to be a day when you stand before the Almighty. And therefore, I'm not going to be corrupt. And even so, I will not be an eye servant. I've served, and I served well. And I'm saying, if you get an actuary, somebody who could tell us, had we not been there, what would have been the results? You will see that we saved this country billions of dollars. You also will notice that the index, this transparency index, that is a worldwide index stating where a country is and when compared to others on this chart. Guyana's chart moved positively. It moved in a positive or in the right direction. Several jumps during the Granger years. We covered it. Well, there are different indices that you use, but in some of them we covered up to seven jumps in the right direction. Not due to SARA alone. Must confess that the Ministry of Legal Affairs did some work. Other agencies did some work, but we played our role so that we are no longer. By the time the administration left office, we were not classified as we were. We were not looked down upon as we were when the Granger administration began its rule. So I trust beyond that, at least the public is better informed.
All right. Well, we are going to be the onlookers. I noticed that, issues have already begun to arise in relation to this whole idea of corruption.
Yeah.
And you, with your knowledge, I would hope that you will be one of those who will be there to expose
Certainly.
whatever you see, either through, well, if the papers are going to publish a letter, so, but you will have to use other avenues.
I'd also like to say and give credit to Glenn Lal. Now, people may argue Glenn Lal is this, Glenn Lal is that, but Glenn Lal has convinced me, and I asked him face to face, I said, look, why do you do this, Glenn? And he said to me, look, I just don't believe in stealing. And I believe that the average man and woman in this country should benefit from the wealth of this country. And so every day you see him publishing something about the oil blocks. He is doing that not because he wants attention or even to sell his papers. He is doing that as a genuine Guyanese. And I think we may have other issues, but we must understand, and I don't believe in clothing one thing with the next. When it comes to exposing the corruption in the oil blocks, Glenn Lal is playing a leading role.
All right, Brother Retmyer, I want to thank you very much for coming and educating us in this way about the work of SARA and making us understand that we were getting to a better place through your agency. And now we're uncertain where we're going to go, all right?
I'd also like to say thanks to Minister Harmon, where we worked with Minister of the Presidency. That man went out of his way to give us a good footing. Basil Williams, in his own way, was helpful. And Minister Keith Scott gave us unconditional support all along the way.
All right, to the people out there, I want to thank you for being again with us on this program of Walter Rodney Groundings, and I look forward to being with you next week, same time, same channel, for another program of Walter Rodney Groundings. Do have a good night.